Hello, Miss Anderson's class. We're going to continue on with the Tiger Rising. Chapter 25. The three of them walked through the woods in silence. Sistine and Rob chewed 8-ball gum, and Willie Mae smoked a cigarette, and nobody said a word. "Good Lord," said Willie Mae when they came upon the cage. She stared at the prancing animal. "Ain't no reason to doubt the fierceness of God when he makes something like that," she said. "Who was the fool that caged up this tiger?" "He belongs to Mr. Bucamp," Rob told her. "Bucamp," Willie Mae said with disgust. She shook her head. "One person in the world that don't need to be owning no tiger, and that's Bucamp." "See," said Sistine. "It's not right, is it? Just like you told Rob about your bird and how you had to let her go." "A bird," Miss Willie Mae said, "that's one thing. The tiger belongs to Bucamp is another. Tell Rob that he should unlock the cage and let him go." "I ain't," said Willie Mae. "You got to ask yourself what's going to happen to this tiger after you let him go. How's he going to live?" Rob was flooded with sad relief. Willie Mae wasn't going to make him do it. He wasn't going to lose the tiger. "Panthers live in these woods," argued Sistine. "They survive." "Used to," said Willie Mae. "Don't no more." Sistine put her hands on her hips. "You're not saying what you believe," she accused. "You're not talking like a prophetess." "That's 'cause I ain't," said Willie Mae. "And all I am is someone speaking the truth. And the truth is, there ain't nothing you can do for this tiger except let it be." "It's not right," said Sistine. "Right ain't got nothing to do with it," muttered Willie Mae. "Sometimes right don't count." "I can't wait until my father comes to get me here," said Sistine. "He knows what's right. He'll set this tiger free." Rob looked at Sistine. "Your daddy ain't coming for you," he said softly, shaking his head, amazed at what he suddenly knew to be the truth. "My father is coming to get me," Sistine said. "Nah," Rob said sadly, "he ain't. He's a liar, like your mama said." "You're a liar," said Sistine in a dark, cold voice. Her face was so white that it seemed to glow before him. "And I hate you," she said. "Everybody at school hates you, too, even the teachers. You're a sissy. I hope I never ever see you again." She turned and walked away, and Rob stood and considered her words. He felt them on his skin like shards of broken glass. He was afraid to move. He was afraid of how deep they might go into him. "She don't mean it," said Willie Mae. "She don't mean none of what she said right now." Rob shrugged. He bent and scratched his legs as hard as he could. He scratched and scratched, digging his nails in deep, trying to get to the bottom of the itch that was always there. "Stop it," Willie Mae told him. Rob looked up. "Let me tell you something. I would love to see this tiger rise up out of her cage." "Yes, I would like to see him rise up and attack Bucamp. Serve him right for keeping a wild animal locked up, putting you in the middle of this, giving you the keys to the cage. Come on." She grabbed hold of Rob's hand. "Let's get on up out of here." As they walked back to the Kentucky Star, Rob thought about what Willie Mae had said about the tiger rising up. It reminded him of what she had said about his sadness needing to rise up. And when he thought about the two things together, the tiger and the sadness, the truth circled over and above him, and then came and landed lightly on his shoulders. He knew what he had to do. He left Willie Mae at the motel and went down to the highway. "Sistine," he shouted at her. "Sistine," he screamed. And miraculously he saw her. the orange dress with the pink polka dots, glowing in the horizon. Sistine Bailey. "Hey," he shouted, "Sistine, I've got something to tell you." "I'm not talking to you," she shouted back, but she stopped. She turned around, and she put her hands on her hips. She ran faster. "I come to tell you about the tiger," he said when he caught up with her. "What about him?" "I'm fixin' to let him go," said Rob. Sistine squinted her eyes at him. "You won't do it," she said. "Yes, I will," he told her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys and held them in front of her, proudly, as if he had just conjured them up out of thin air, as if they had never existed before. "I'm going to do it," he said. "I'm going to do it for you." "Ooh-wee!" somebody screamed, and Rob turned and saw Bucamp come speeding right towards them in his red Jeep. "Oh, no," whispered Rob. "Is it him?" Rob nodded. Bucamp pulled over to the side of the road, sprayed mud and water everywhere. "You out getting your exercise?" he hollered. Rob shrugged. "Speak up," roared Bucamp. He got out of the Jeep and came towards them. Rob quickly pocketed the keys, his heart thumping once, loudly, as if it was cautioning him to keep quiet. And then it went back to beating normally. "Well, looky here," said Bucamp. When he looked at Sistine. "You out chasing girls? Is that it? Man after my own heart. This your girlfriend?" Bucamp pounded Rob on the back. "No, sir," he said. He looked at Sistine. She was staring so hard at Bucamp that Rob was afraid the man might burst into flames. "I got more goods for you," Bucamp said. "I left 'em back at the motel with Ida Bell." "Yes, sir," said Rob. "What's your name, little thing?" Bucamp said, turning to Sistine. Rob's heart gave another warning thump. Lord only knew what Sistine would say. But Sistine, as always, surprised him. She smiled sweetly at Bucamp. "Sissy," she said. "Well, that's pretty," said Bucamp. "That's the kind of name worth running down the road after." He leaned over to Rob. "Remember what we got going. You're keeping your manly secrets, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. Bucamp winked. "I got me some business in town," he said. He squeezed Rob's shoulder hard, then took his hand away. "You and your girlfriend stay out of trouble now, you hear?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. Bucamp swaggered back to the Jeep. Rob and Sistine stood together and watched him get in and roar down the highway. "He's afraid," said Sistine. "He's afraid of the tiger. That's why he's making you feed him." Rob nodded. That was another truth he had known without knowing it. The same as he had known that Sistine's father was not coming back. He must, he realized, know somewhere deep inside of him more things that he had ever dreamed of. "I'm sorry," he said. "What I said about your daddy, I'm sorry." "I don't want to talk about my father," said Sistine. "Maybe he is coming back to get you." "He's not coming to get me," Sistine tossed her head. "And I don't care. It doesn't matter. What matters is the tiger. Let's go. Let's go let him go loose." The first key slid into the first lock so smoothly that it made Rob dizzy with amazement. It was going to be easy to let the tiger go. "Hurry," Sistine said. "Hurry up. Get the other locks." He opened the second and third locks, and then he took them off one by one, handing them to Sistine, who laid them on the ground. "Now open the door," she said. Rob's heart pounded and fluttered in his chest. "What if he eats us?" "He won't," said Sistine. "He'll leave us alone out of gratitude." wore his emancipators. Yeah. Rab flung the door wide. "Now get out," he shouted, and they both jumped back from the door and waited. But the tiger ignored them. He continued to pace back and forth in the cage, oblivious to the open door. "Go on," Rob said to him. "You're free," Sistine whispered, but the tiger did not even look in the direction of the door. Sistine crept forward and grabbed hold of the cage. She shook it. "Get out," she screamed. "Get out," she said, turning to Rob. Help me get him out." Rob grabbed hold of the fence and shook it. "Git!" Tiger stopped prancing and turned to stare at both of them, clinging like monkeys to the cage. "Go on," Rob shouted, suddenly furious. He shook the cage. He yelled. He put his head back and howled. He saw that the sky above them was thick with clouds, and that made him even angrier. He yelled louder. He shouted at the dark sky, took the cage in as hard as he could. Sistine put a hand on his arm. "Shh," she said. "He's leaving. Watch." As they stared, the tiger stepped with grace and delicacy out of the cage. He put his nose up and sniffed. He took one tiny step, then another. Then he stopped and stood still. Sistine clapped her hands. The tiger turned and looked back at both of them, his eyes blazing. Then he started to run. He ran so fast, it looked to Rob like he was flying. His muscles moved like a river. It was hard to believe that the cage had ever contained him. It didn't seem possible. The tiger went leaping through the grass, moving further and further away from Rob and Sistine. He looked like the sun, rising and setting again and again. And watching him, Rob felt his own heart rising and falling. "Oh," said Sistine. "See," she said. "That's the right thing. That was the right thing to do." Rob nodded, but in his mind he saw a flash of green. "What?" said Sistine, turning towards him. "What are you thinking about?" Rob shook his head. "Nothing." "Robert!" The sound of his name came floating to them from a distance. "That's my dad. That's my dad calling." And then they heard Willie Mae. "Do Jesus!" she screamed, her voice high and wild. And then there was a crack of a gun. They both stood still, stunned and silent. And when Willie Mae came running out from under the pine trees and saw them, she stopped. "Thank you, Jesus," she said, looking up at the sky. "2 whole children. Come on. Thank you." She opened her eyes. "Come to me." Rob started walking towards her. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to tell her he didn't feel whole. But he didn't have the energy or the heart to say anything. All he could manage was putting one foot in front of the other. All he could do was keep walking towards Willie Mae. Willie Mae led them back. When Rob saw the tiger on the ground and his father standing over it holding the rifle, he felt something rise up in him, an anger so big and powerful as the tiger. "You killed him," he said to his father. "I had to." "That was my tiger," Rob screamed. "You killed him. You killed my tiger." He ran at his father and attacked him. He beat him with his fist. He kicked him, but his father stood like a wall. He held the gun up over his head and kept his eyes open and took each hit without blinking. And Rob saw that hitting wasn't going to be good enough. He did something he thought he would never do. He opened his suitcase. The words sprang out of it, coiled and explosive. "I wish it had been you," he screamed. "I wish it had been you that died. I hate you. You ain't the one I need. I need her. I need her." He stared at his father. His father stared at him. "Say her name," Rob screamed in silence. "You say it." "Caroline," his father whispered, with the gun over his head, with his eyes still open. And with the small sound of his mother's name, the world lurched back into motion. Like an old merry-go-round, it started to spin again. His father put the gun down and pulled Rob to him. "Caroline," his father whispered. "Caroline." Rob buried his face in his father's shirt. It smelled like sweat and turpentine and green leaves. "I need her," Rob said. "I need her too," said his father, pulling Rob closer. But we don't got her. Neither one of us. What we got, all we got, is each other. We got to learn to make do with that. "I ain't gonna cry," Rob said, shutting his eyes, but his tears leaked out of him anyways. Then they came in a rush, and he couldn't stop. He cried from somewhere deep inside of himself, from the place where his mother had been, the same place that the tiger had been, and was gone now. Rob looked up and saw his father wiping tears from his own eyes. "All right," his father said, holding Rob tight. "That's all right," he said. "You're okay." When Rob finally looked again, he saw Willie Mae holding Sistine like she was a baby, rocking her and saying, "Shh." Willie Mae stared back at him. "Don't think you're going to start pounding on me now," she said. "No, ma'am," said Rob. He wiped the back of his hand across his nose and slid out of his father's arms. "I went and got your daddy," Willie Mae said. Told Rob as she swung back and forth, rocking Sistine. "I figured out what you were going to do, and there ain't no telling what that tiger would have done once he got out of his cage. I went and got your daddy so he could save you." "Yes, ma'am," said Rob. He went and stood over the open-eyed tiger. The bullet hole in his head was small and red. It didn't look big enough to kill him. "Go ahead, touch him," said Sistine. Rob looked up. She was standing beside him. Her dress was twisted and wrinkled. Her eyes were red. Rob stared at her and she nodded, so he knelt and put his hand out and placed it on the tiger's head. He felt the tears rise up in him again. Sistine crouched down next to him. She put her hand on the tiger. "He was so pretty," she said. "He was one of the prettiest things I have ever seen." Rob nodded. "We have to have a funeral for him. He's a fallen warrior. We have to bury him, right?" Rob sat down next to the tiger and ran his hands over the rough fur again and again until the tears traveled down his cheeks and dripped onto the ground. Rob and his father worked with shovels to dig a hole that was deep enough and wide enough and dark enough to hold the tiger, and the whole time it rained. "We got to say some words over him," said Willie Mae, when the hole was done and the tiger was in it. "Can't cover up nothing without saying some words. I'll say the poem." She folded her hands in front of her and looked down at the ground. "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night." Rob closed his eyes. What immortal hand or eye could frame thine fearful symmetry? In that distant deeps or sky burnt the fire of shiny eyes. On what wings dare he aspire? To Rob, the words sounded like music, but better. His eyes filled with tears again. He worried that now that he had started crying, he might never stop. "That's all I remember," Sistine said after a minute. "There's more to it, but I can't remember it. You say something, Rob." "I don't got nothing to say," said Rob, "except for I loved him." "Well," said Willie Mae, "what I got to say, I ain't had good experiences with animals in cage. cages. She reached into her dress pocket and took out the wooden bird. She bent down and laid it on top of the tiger. "That ain't nothing, just a little bird to keep you company." She stepped back and away from the grave. Rob's father cleared his throat. He hummed softly, and Rob thought he was going to sing, but instead, he shook his head. "I had to shoot him. I'm sorry, but I had to shoot him. For Rob." Rob leaned into his father, and it felt for a minute like his father leaned back. Then Rob picked up the shovel and started covering the tiger with dirt. As he filled the grave, something danced and flickered on his arm. Rob stared at it, wondering what it was. Then he recognized it. It was the sun, showing up in time for another funeral. "I'm sorry I made you do it," Sistine said to Rob. "He wouldn't be dead if I hadn't made you do it." "It's all right. I ain't sorry about what I did. We can make a headstone for him. We can bring flowers and put them on his grave, fresh ones every day. I didn't mean what I said before about you being a sissy. And I don't hate you. You're my best friend." The whole way back to the Kentucky Star, Rob held on to Sistine's hand. He marveled at what a small hand it was and how much comfort there was in holding it. He marveled, too, at how different he felt inside, how much lighter, as if he had set something heavy down and walked away. That night, his father sang to Rob as he put the medicine on his legs. He sang the song about mining for gold, the one that he had used to sing to Rob's mother. When he was done with the medicine and the song, he cleared his throat. "Caroline loves that song." "Me too," said Rob. "I like it too." His father stood up. "We're going to have to tell Bucamp that you was the one that let the tiger out." "Yes, sir," said Rob. "I'll tell him I was the one who shot him, but you got to admit to letting him go." "Yes, sir," said Rob. "I could lose my job over it." "I know," Rob told him, but he wasn't afraid. He thought about Bucamp shaking hands. Bucamp was a coward. He knew that now. "I thought I would tell him I would work for him to pay for what I'd done. You can offer up some reasonable kind of solution, but it don't mean he'll go for it. There ain't no predicting Bucamp, other than to say he's going to be mad." Rob nodded. "And on Monday, I aim to call the principal and tell him you're coming back to school. I ain't messing around with taking you to more doctors. You're going back, that's that." "Yes, sir," said Rob. He didn't mind the thought of going back to school. School was where Sistine was. His father cleared his throat. "It's hard for me to talk about your mama. I wouldn't never have believed that I could miss somebody the way I miss her. Saying her name pains me, but I'll say it for you, and I'll try on your account." Rob looked at his father's hands. They were the hands that held him when he cried. They were complicated hands, Rob thought. "You want some macaroni and cheese for dinner?" his father asked. "Sounds all right," said Rob. "Macaroni and cheese sounds really good." That night, Rob dreamed he and Sistine were standing at the private grave. He didn't know for what, but then he saw a fluttering of green wings and he understood. It was the wooden bird, only he wasn't made of wood, he was real. And he flew up out of the tiger's grave, and they chased him, laughing and bumping into each other. They tried to catch him, but they couldn't. "See," said Sistine, "I told you it was like fireworks." He woke up smiling, staring at the ceiling of the motel room. "Guess what?" his father called to him from outside. "What?" Rob said. "There ain't a cloud in the sky," said his father. That's what. Rob lay in his bed, watching the sun poke its way through the curtains. He thought about Sistine and the tiger he wanted to make for her. He thought about what kind of wood he would use and how big he would make the tiger. He thought about how happy Sistine would be when she saw it. He lay in bed and considered the future outside his window. The tiny neon Kentucky star rose and fell, competing bravely with the light of the morning sun. The end.